Thank you very much. That was kind. This is rather a funny first slide, I realize. It's taken from the, whoever it was, man or woman, who designed the cover of our new book, The Inner Level. And it talks about a little bit about narcissism and modesty. He decided a peacock was a symbol of narcissism, and the pigeon was a more modest little bird. But you'll see how that fits in later. I suppose I feel that one of the most important things, deficits in our understanding of the world, is how we are affected by our social environment, the nature of the world we live in. And I think we get endless things wrong because we don't understand the social processes we're part of. That's not how I thought about inequality in my work on inequality when I was doing it, but it seems to me that's in a way why it's important. Inequality is much more fundamental a dimension of human society than I think we had realized at all. But as soon as you start looking at the data and thinking about the processes behind the data, you start. It's a bit like if you think about any animal, take some kind of monkey, the first question you should ask if you want to know about its social and sexual behavior is, does it have a strong ranking system? It's absolutely fundamental to the nature of different organizations, how egalitarian or how hierarchical they are. In a way, all I have to tell you is this over and over again. I found that graph on Google Images, and I thought somebody's understood. I didn't draw it. And what I'm going to show you rather often is just different problems on that vertical axis. But basically, what we've done is show that so many problems get worse in more unequal societies. Inequality in terms of income differences between rich and poor. And then in our more recent book, The Inner Level, why that is true. So moving on to see what lies behind the data. This, I suppose, is an indication of most people, I think, have an extraordinarily naive view of inequality, that it only matters if it creates absolute poverty, but actually it brings out features of our evolved psychology, as I say here, to do with dominance and subordination, superiority and inferiority. It makes all those feelings of social differentiation more important. It affects how we treat each other. In a world where some people are worth so much more than others, it undermines our own feelings of self-worth in a way I'll describe to you. And all those worries about how we're seen and judged by others are exacerbated in societies with those bigger income differences and increasing the feeling that people are very different, if you like, personal worth. Just to give you an idea of the sort of data we were using when we did our spirit level book, we used that measure there written at the top. How much richer the top 20% in each country than the bottom 20%? How big is that gap? And you see in the more equal countries on the left, Japan, Finland, Norway, Sweden, they're about 3.5 or 4 times as rich as the bottom 20%. But in the more unequal countries, Singapore, USA, Portugal, UK, the gap is twice as big. I may say that we never judge the validity of the figures we're using. We just download them from international organizations. So the income inequality figures came from UN Human Development Report. When we downloaded them, they were the same as the World Bank were using. Other figures come from WHO, from OECD, from things like that. and our absolute rule is that if the data source has data for one of the countries that we're looking at, it goes into the analysis. We make no judgments as that's the job of the WHO or whoever. And so, you know, it angered me when we were accused of cherry picking, because of course, you know, you can't do that. In any sort of, it would be idiotic to do that. And this is just a summary of our the spirit level work before I move on to our later work. And you see we got data for each of these countries on their life expectancy, on kids' maths and literacy scores. Those are the OECD PISA tests. The infant mortality rates, homicide rates, imprisonment. That's simply the proportion of the population in prison. Teenage birth rates, measures of trust from the World Value Survey, obesity rates from the International Obesity Task Force, mental illness. Those are WHO figures. And the ordinary classification of mental illness classifies drug and alcohol addiction as mental illness. So it includes those figures and some figures on social mobility. There you see them all in one index. So where a country is, it's a sort of average position on all those things. They're all weighted equally. The good things have been reverse scored, so the higher the score, the worse the outcomes are. And you see USA, Portugal, UK, the more unequal countries doing badly on all those things, and Japan, Scandinavians doing well. We were worried that people would think we'd just chosen problems to suit our argument, but to show that wasn't true, we showed you get just the same results if you use another index. So here is the UNICEF index of child well-being, whereas that last one, I don't know, it had 10 or 12 components. This has about 40 components. It's made up to measure child well-being in the rich countries. We had nothing to do with it. And you can see there the more unequal countries doing worse, down at the bottom right. And the more equal ones, with those smaller income differences between top and bottom, Japan, the Scandinavian countries doing well. The UNICEF Index of Child Well-being contains all sorts of things, like whether kids feel they can talk to their parents, what immunization rates are like, whether there's bullying in schools, what the maths and literacy scores are like. It also contains the proportion of kids in relative poverty. As that is so close to a measure of inequality, we took that out of the index. Otherwise, it would have been a bit of a circular argument to say that more children in relative poverty in more unequal countries. So that's only that adjustment. We did papers on this. There was an earlier index which we published a paper on it and its components in the British Medical Journal, and then this one in Pediatrics. We also looked at changes between the two indexes over about 10 years, and of course the countries with the biggest rises in inequality have had the biggest deteriorations in child well-being. Just a few examples of the kind of and what the individual components of our index look like on their own. Each of them is separately related to inequality. So this is the proportion of prisoners per 100,000 population. And it goes from about 40 prisoners per 100,000 up to about 400. So tenfold differences in the proportion of the population locked up in these rich developed countries. When we were doing this, there were some American states which spent more on prisons than on higher education. You get into really quite daft expenditures with too much inequality. You spend on bad things rather than good things, if you like. We did all this analysis not only on these rich developed countries, but we repeated it on the 50 American states, asking just the same question: do the more unequal states do badly on all these things? The picture is very, very similar. We just wanted 2 different test beds, so that adds to the evidence that this is a reliable relationship. I'm going to show you quite a bit of other people's work. This is Frank Elgar looking at school bullying in 37 countries there. This is the proportion of 11-year-olds who bullied others 2 or more times a month. Bullying is pretty serious. I mean, you see even in fairly crude data the very long-term effects of having been bullied at school. But look at the scale of the differences. The percent down there, the bottom gap is 0 to 5% of kids who bullied others, and up at the top you've got around 20%. So huge differences in bullying related quite strongly to inequality. All these graphs I'm showing you, of course, statistically significant, and so they are amongst the American states. I like to include this because I saw it just the other day in The Economist, which, at last the message seems to be getting over in some establishment journals. You won't be able to read this, but it's 4 different measures of crime in relation to inequality, and you see the scattered dots upwards. But I was really pleased that the Economist called it the stark relationship between income inequality and crime. When we were doing this stuff, people talked as if we'd fabricated the evidence. And I think actually one of the oddest things about our spirit level book is someone else didn't do it 20 years earlier. People, I think, I remember we were confronted by some Tory minister, one of Thatcher's ministers, who said, okay, supposing we accept that inequality has these damaging social consequences, surely we need it to spur initiative, creativity, economic growth, innovation, all that kind of thing. And we spent some time discussing how can we get a measure of creativity, and we thought we'd look at patents per head of population, and we found that there were marginally more patents per head of population in more equal countries. But since then, this much bigger analysis has come out, and it shows, it's really a pretty powerful relationship, a tendency for those more unequal countries. The more unequal countries in almost all my graphs are on the right, but with fewer patents per head of population. And that makes a lot of sense, that those societies are less creative, because I've already shown you they have more people in prison, but they also have more people with drug problems. They have more people, in American data, is dropping out of high school. They have lower maths and literacy scores in more unequal countries, lower social mobility, I'll show you that. So in a sense, what the picture that builds up is that countries are wasting their talent, that the damaging effects of inequality have very high human and social or economic costs. And so this fits into that kind of picture. I'm not going to go on talking simply about showing you examples from our index. I want to point out that in a way we're not saying anything new. The relationships with inequality are really just telling us more about the relationships we've always known with social status, social class, social position. You know, everyone here knows that health, life expectancy is worst in the poorest areas of each city. You know that kids do less well at school. All sorts of different outcomes are worst amongst the poorest. It is very much those problems which are worse in more unequal societies. So in a sense, all we're saying is problems which we know have social gradients problems we know are related to social status in our own society get bigger when you increase the social status differences. We should always have recognized that. It's obvious. It hardly needs saying. And you know, basically, I think we're really talking about whether we live in a society with a very steep social class hierarchy like that, or a much shallower one like that. And it changes the nature of class relationships and the importance of social position and so on. So I think that's what's going on. We actually did quite a formal, when we started to think this is something about problems with social gradients, we did a formal test of it in the American Journal of Public Health, and we looked to see whether, we took different causes of death, some with little or no social gradient, like breast cancer or prostate cancer. You know, from those, your chances of getting those don't differ very much by social class. But then things like heart disease or respiratory disease have strong social gradients. And of course, we find the stronger the social gradient, the more strongly the relationship with inequality is. The only surprise is that these problems don't just get more common amongst the least well-off. They don't just get more common amongst the poor with greater inequality. The biggest effects are amongst the poor, but even the better off are affected to a lesser extent. Maybe this slide's rather out of place, but basically it shows you that there's less social mobility in more unequal societies. I think we were the first people to show this on less data than this comes from the Brookings Institution in Washington, and it's intergenerational social mobility. So it's really asking, do rich parents have rich children and poor parents have poor children, or isn't parental income very important? And it's much more important in societies with big income differences than it is in countries with smaller income differences. Because, surprise, surprise, parents pass on their advantages and disadvantages to their children in different ways. Again, absolutely obvious. And all the sort of crocodile tears and stuff from politicians about low social mobility and so on. Basically, if you really want to do something about social mobility, you reduce the income differences in the society between their parents and so on. That's what really makes a difference. Yes, this in a way should have been the next slide after the pyramids. This is just my attempt to sort of put in diagrammatic form what I think's going on from the number of papers we've read, which are able to show you how people at different points in the hierarchy are affected by inequality. So think of this as a graph for any bad outcome, like death rates. Higher death rates are worse, or mental illness, more mental illness. So bad things at the top. The more unequal countries have steeper social gradients, like that top line. And in more equal countries, they're shallower social gradients. But the whole line is below the other one, so they don't cross over. And the differences are biggest, differences in performance between more and less equal societies are biggest amongst the least well-off, but even amongst the well-off there's some advantage in living in a more equal country. And by that I mean, if we took you people with your, whatever your incomes are, your education, your job, and moved you to a more equal country, you'd probably live a little bit longer. Your kids might do better at school. They'd be less likely to become seriously involved in drugs. You would be less likely to become a victim of violence. In that sense, we all do better in a more equal society. I may say, again and again, you see bits of research or things related to policy, people talking about trying to find ways of improving public health which not only improve the average health for the whole society, but reduce the health inequalities. This, you see, reduces health inequalities. The gradient becomes shallower in more unequal societies, and it also improves health right across society. I think we're a rather mixed up society. You know, if you take pictures of people when they're posing for their photo, everyone puts their arms around each other and they smile, and you know, they're just, life is wonderful. But take pictures of people when they don't know they're having their picture taken, and they look rather different. You know, they all look depressed and haggard, and some of them quite angry. These are people going to work outside Oxford Tube Station, so they're not the unemployed or the homeless or anything like that. They're people in the prime of life in a rich, developed country. But the contrast between those is really quite remarkable. In fact, this is an ad for a counseling and psychotherapy organization in California. It's obviously extremely successful, completely transforms the well-being of its clients until, no doubt, the camera has gone away and then they go back to, I don't know. But anyway, I think it is interesting that those two versions of the reality of our lives, and of course on YouTube, on Facebook, you're seeing that version again and again. But when you start looking at the statistics, this is a survey from the Mental Health Foundation that came out last year. 3/4 of adults, they found, felt so stressed they were overwhelmed or unable to cope sometime in the past year. And almost 1/3 of adults had suicidal feelings as a result of stress. Half that number had actually self-harmed sometime in their lives. And of course those figures look as if they're getting worse over time in many of the rich developed countries, and the rates are worse amongst young people. And you know, why on earth, when we live with more comfort and luxury than almost unprecedented in human history, are we in that sort of shape? And we know that these high levels of stress are damaging even physical health and life expectancy. This is along the bottom here, you've got measures of stress from the lowest to the highest. We know quite a lot about how chronic stress affects physiological processes, and why in long-term stress the effects look rather like more rapid aging. You become more vulnerable to a whole range of conditions. But you see that even the very early, still 1 and 2 are still pretty low levels of stress, but they're still associated with slightly higher death rates, and it goes up step by step. So, you know, this is something that matters. Now, I said something earlier when I was starting about how a more unequal society, some people are seen as being worth so much more than others, and others are looked down on almost as trash. as worthless. And with that, it looks as if we judge each other more by social position. You know, you're someone I have to treat properly and respect, or you are nothing. And with that goes more worry about how we are judged by others. You know, you might perhaps trust yourself to be nice to everyone regardless of their social status, to be respectful and so on, and yet you don't trust other people to not to make those judgments, not to judge your internal or personal worth from your external wealth. We have many fears about how we're seen and judged, and always trying to sort of do different forms of positive self-representation. What this graph shows, though, is levels of status anxiety in more and less equal societies. Along the bottom here, you haven't got income distribution. You've got each section of the range of incomes, from the poorest tenth of the population there to the richest tenth of the population there. And the top line are the levels of status anxiety in the more unequal countries amongst the rich developed countries. The bottom here is the lower levels of status anxiety. That's less worried about how you're seen and judged. Of course, all these lines slope downwards, meaning that the poor feel more status anxiety than the rich. But everyone feels more status anxiety in all the income groups in the more unequal countries. Because you see, inequality, material differences between us make class and status more important. That's the measure of your worth. That's how you feel other people judge you. That's what's going on behind so much of this. And we also know, again from very recent work, that if you ask people to give a judgment of their own social status, you know, typically people are given a sort of diagram of a ladder, and CEOs of big companies are put at the top and unskilled manual workers at the bottom. Which rung of the ladder do you put yourself on? And it's quite interesting that in the more unequal countries, everyone in all income groups gives themselves a slightly lower social status. So, you know, we're all feeling a bit inferior. Something like that's happening. We know people are very sensitive to these issues to do with superiority and inferiority. Any psychologists amongst you will know these stereotype threat experiments. There are quite a lot of them. What this one is kids from different Indian castes given little pen and paper tests to do. And when they do them, the high and low caste kids, not knowing who is high and who is low, they do equally well. But as soon as they do know each other's caste, a big gap opens up. And that's been shown if you do this sort of experiment with people from different class backgrounds, different ethnicities, different genders. So I'm told there's even an experiment, a paper showing that how women do on some tests is affected by whether they tick a box to say whether they're male or female at the beginning of the test or at the end of the test. So if you're reminded that in some quite gentle, subtle way sometimes, that you belong to a group that's normally thought of as inferior in the sort of things that this test is about, then it damages your performance. As you'd expect, where class and status are more important, parents are pushing their kids to get on. You know, your life depends on getting these exam results and going to a good college and all the rest of it. So this is percent of parents who praise hard work in their kids. And you see it goes from about 10% up to 90%. Really amazing differences. And at the same time, they're less likely to praise imagination in their children. You know, that's not what it's about. This is real life. You've got to get on. And it's remarkable that these things come out in a way, predictable and immediately understandable ways. Now, I want to say a few things about mental illness. We've known for some time that mental illness is more common in more unequal societies. This is the percent of the population with any mental illness in the previous year. There's sort of threefold differences there. It's not people who've been diagnosed with depression or anxiety disorders who've been into GP or hospital, because that would be too influenced by how you access medical care, whether you recognize mental illness or not. So what they do here, WHO used diagnostic interviews on random samples of the population. So if you were picked up in a random sample, you were asked about your feelings of self-worth, whether about your sleeping, your appetite, all friendships, all sorts of things that have been found to be diagnostic of mental illness. So that kind of thing. But we now know more. When we did this graph, we didn't really know why. We assumed that it was because social cohesion is lower, community life is lower in more unequal countries. But Sherry Johnson at Berkeley in California, psychologist, and her colleagues went through a huge literature on mental illnesses and personality disorders, looking at how they interacted with what she calls the dominance behavioral system. Apparently, just like animals live in social hierarchies, we have an area of our brain that deals with these issues of dominance and subordination. You know, if you're an inferior monkey, you have to know you're inferior. You have to behave in obsequious ways, unthreatening ways to dominance. You have to know who's dominant, you have to know who's subordinate, you have to know where everyone is, and how to treat people above and below you. She shows that a number of conditions are exacerbated or initiated by interaction with these issues to do with dominance and subordination. When I read that paper, it was clear she was assuming that all societies, all rich societies, basically have a very similar social hierarchy. And I wrote to her and I said, I think that actually the countries with the bigger income differences, the social hierarchy is steeper, as I showed you earlier. And actually there is beginning to be evidence that the conditions you're talking about are indeed more common in more unequal societies. So I'll just show you. Before I get on to showing you the examples, it seems to me there are two responses to issues of dominance and superiority, superiority and inferiority being so much more important, us all being more worried about how we're seen and judged. Either you can be filled with, I don't know, lack of confidence, low self-esteem, social anxiety. You start to find social action quite stressful. Maybe if it's bad, you withdraw from social life. It's just all too difficult, and and let me just read you a sort of quote. I haven't got time to read them all, but someone, for example, is saying, I'm extremely shy among both people I know and people I don't know. It hinders my everyday life so much that people think I'm making it up. I have no friends. it's hard for me to go anywhere. I always make sure I go shopping in the day. That way I can wear sunglasses or a hat. It's my security blanket from social anxiety disorder. I get tongue-tied and sweaty when I feel like they're looking at me, like I'm some sort of freak. It's a living hell I struggle with on a daily basis. Of course, that's only a very small minority of the population, but we all know that to some degree. We all know those feelings of awkwardness, self-consciousness, and if we feel people choose not to sit next to us or include us in things, we still very quickly develop worries about, how maybe they think we're boring, unattractive, and so on. So that's one response, and it goes with, but there's also this opposite response. So if I feel I'm worried about how you see me, I try and appear as very clever and knowledgeable, high status, and wealthy, buy a better car and live in a smart part of town, and all the ways in which you show status. So you can respond to that worry about how you're seen and judged in those two different ways. And as Sherry Johnson says, it might be that you just accept your inferiority. Or you might be permanently fighting against it, feel everyone's trying to put you down. Life is a matter of fighting against that all the time. That often goes with high levels of violence. Or you may just be, on the other hand, assuming your superiority, or endlessly struggling to portray yourself in a good light. And anyway, you can see these responses, both those kinds, more common in more unequal countries. So more depression, several studies showing more depression in more unequal countries. This is something called self-enhancement, which is a bit like narcissism. In this study, an international team of psychologists asked people in these different countries, how do you think you compare with others in your society? So do you think you're cleverer than most people in Britain? Do you think you're more attractive? Do you feel you've got more social understanding, more empathy? So people were asked to rate themselves in relation to the average. You've probably heard the joke that 90% of them, no, I think it's 96% of Americans think they're better drivers than average. Only about 60% of Swedes think they're better drivers, still an overestimate. But what this is showing is that much higher rates of self-enhancement in the more unequal countries. So you're talking yourself up, you're bigging yourself up in other people's eyes. You're going through that sort of self-advertisement. And you can also see the few figures there are on changes in narcissism over time. This is American data. It seems to fit roughly what's been going on with inequality in the US. This is schizophrenia, one of the other conditions that Sherry Johnson covered. None of this is our work, but people showing, and before they knew, these papers are before they knew of Sherry Johnson's work, just noticing that more unequal societies have worse outcomes. So I do think that that initial graph we had, where is it? Yeah, this one. It now makes much more sense. We know more about how people are affected by issues to do with heightened issues of dominance and subordination. The most obvious way in which we all big ourselves up in each other's eyes is through consumerism, trying to buy the right stuff. And there are now studies, which there weren't when we were working initially, showing that if you live in more unequal areas, you're more likely to spend money on a flashy car or looking for goods with the right labels, the smart fashion labels and so on. and some people even buy rubbish bags to suit. Looks rather surprising. Still, it's probably a fairly cheap way of looking good. But those, the way the inequality is affected by, the way consumerism is affected by inequality isn't just marginal. You see, this is data from 1965 to 2005 or so. The dotted blue line is the rise of inequality. The green line is the rise in debt over time. It's household debt. It's had the economic booms and slumps smoothed out of it, not by us. I suspect that what that is showing how we try and keep up with each other, how status does become more important with more inequality. And actually in the great crash of 1929, there was also there was a peak of inequality and peak of debt. I don't know why I've got that there. Oh yes, those anxieties about how we're seen and judged, and you remember I showed that the Mental Health Foundation saying their survey showed such high levels of stress in our society. One of the ways you deal with stress is probably having a few drinks before you go out in the evening. I think young people often feel the only way they can really feel relaxed and they go out is getting really out of their minds. And of course drugs like ecstasy are valued because suddenly all that drops away and you just feel wonderfully loving relationships with all these people you've never seen before. What's so awful about what I'm describing, I think, is that now both the health data shows that friendship is extraordinarily important to, it's extraordinarily protective of health, but also the studies of happiness are now saying that a powerful determinant of happiness is the quality of your relationships, your social connections, whether involved in community life, how many friends you have, things like that. It's about the quality of our social relationships, both health and happiness. What was that? Yeah, that's just pointing out the meta-analysis of, I think, 150 studies showing how protective friendship is of health. But, what I think is really going on at the bottom of this is really, the clue is that social status and friendship are as I call them, the Jekyll and Hyde of public health. You see bigger status differences associated with worse overall health. Low social status is extremely damaging to almost any measure of health, but friendship is protective. And in a way, those two things, social hierarchy and friendship, are the two opposite ways we can come together. And if you think of this in terms of human evolution, the quality of our relationships has always been absolutely crucial. I need to know, are you my worst rival, my worst competitor with everything, a real threat to me, or are you the best source of cooperation, safety, learning, love, affection, assistance of every kind? And which you are depends on the quality of social relationships. So words like companion still contain that. Your companions are the people with whom you share the necessities of life. As Marshall Salin says, gifts make friends and friends make gifts. He's an anthropologist who studied the very egalitarian hunting and gathering societies which really, they cover 90 or 95% of human existence. We lived in those extraordinarily egalitarian societies, and they're based on food sharing and gift exchange. And why he says this is, of course, the symbol that I'm not your worst adversary is I recognize your need. I'm willing to share. I give you this. And your sense of indebtedness that maybe means you reciprocate the gift means that Stalin talks about as a sort of basic social compact between people. And of course, with monkeys and so on, we regard grooming as the social cement. That's how they make and maintain links. But in humans, although touch is still very important, you know, you put a hand on someone's arm to express sympathy or whatever, but also the little kindnesses we do for each other all the time are the really powerful bonding, that feeling that we're helpful to each other. And it's very basic, and sharing and gifts. That's what it's about. I've got to stop. I will just say that, you know, lots of evidence that community life, civic participation weakens with more inequality. Trust goes down. People are less likely to feel they can trust others. People are less helpful. All this comes from different studies. People are less helpful to each other in more unequal societies. And you get these huge rises in violence. These are American states and Canadian provinces. You've got about 10-fold differences in homicide rates there, from 15 per million to 150 homicides per million. Very well established in lots of different settings around the world. But if you look at really much more unequal societies than the ones I've been showing you, go to places like Mexico or South Africa, you find it's gone a stage further. People are afraid of each other there. They barricade their houses, they have bars on the windows and doors. Even the guidebooks tell you not to go out at night, it's not safe. So you lose the reciprocity of more equal societies, the helpfulness, the public spiritedness, and if you go far enough you end up with this kind of thing, or the same in South Africa. That's an electric fence at the top, and this says armed response. And this will be my last slide. Exactly that picture is expressed on the basis of wholly different data. This comes from two American economists, and they look at the proportion of the labor force in each country involved in what they call guard labor: security staff, police, prison officers. The more unequal the society, the bigger that section of the labor force. Those are the people we use to protect ourselves from each other. So it goes with that picture of breakdown of community life and increasing fear, higher levels of violence. So that's what inequality does, and it's, you know, absolutely at the core both of health and measures of happiness. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. Really, really interesting. We've got about just shy of 10 minutes. So can I invite anybody to ask any questions or make any comments? I don't have a microphone, so you're going to have to speak nice and clearly. I think you should be fine. Yeah. Most people hate microphones. So.
Loud and clear for me, because I have hearing aids, rather poor hearing.
So can I, who would like to ask the first question or to comment?
Just a thought. Given you said that when you first published your book, The Spirit Level, that a lot of people were quite surprised by it, and there was debate about...
Surprised by it, did you say?
Yeah, you said it's
yes.
been obvious, it's been sitting there for a long time, but
yeah.
people hadn't really done the research. And some people obviously argued against it. What evidence has there been over the last 10 years or so that people have accepted the findings, and is there any evidence that it's been put into public policy anywhere?
I think very little of the latter. Politicians have talked about it, and it came out with when Cameron was leader of the Tories and Miliband of the Labour Party. Both of them were seen carrying it around. Miliband told his shadow cabinet to read it. But of course, inequality has moved up the political agenda enormously since the financial crash. And I think it was in 2013 that there were major statements from Obama, it being the, what does it say, something issue of our era, and the defining issue of our era was inequality. The Pope said it's the source of all evils. Ban Ki-moon at the UN said something similar, so did Christine Lagarde. But I think there's been remarkably little in terms of policy. I think we have to find ways of making of making the establishment quite fearful, also making them feel they're not going to be looked up to and respected from being vastly rich, but regarded as instead as antisocial and selfish.
Any other questions, Steve?
I just wanted to follow on that because I am puzzled by the lack of reaction from politicians. And thinking about you could sell this on a you will save money from public spending. I mean, what you map out in the spirit level and in the inner level are serious problems derived from inequalities that cost states huge amounts of money.
Yeah.
And it would seem to make logical sense to reduce inequalities because that will save you an awful lot of money that you would have to pay out in public spending and the effects of the negative effects of inequalities. So there's clearly something more powerful for the politicians, some kind of ideological thing that's more powerful than them that mitigates against doing something about it. And you would think, given what's gone on in this country with Brexit, and everybody's saying, well, that's an outcome of the neglect of poor parts of the country for years, but it's been turned around into it's the fault of the EU rather than this is an outcome of forces that have generated inequality over a long period of time. I'm not sure, because the question I was going to ask you is, what do we do? But I think the question is more, why haven't we done anything yet? Why haven't the politicians done anything yet, in the face of what is quite overwhelming evidence?
I think that two things. One is that it takes, and I can't remember which historian it was I was reading who talks about the New Deal in the 1930s, Roosevelt, and he said it wasn't the figures on unemployment and so on that led to change. It was the wildcat strikes, the riots, the disorder, which he said put the fear of God into them. And of course Roosevelt sold it to the rich by saying we have to reform in order to preserve. And I think they did feel that, with the rise of communism, they were really afraid of where the system may be going or would go. The other thing is, I think people are extraordinarily bad at understanding these links. I mean, when the Mental Health Foundation came out with that report about high levels of stress, similar things come out every now and then about a number of girls self-harming or something, awful figures that seem to move gradually upwards. Everyone talks about we need more services. And they hardly talk at all about why we are all in this mess. And so they think about individual strategies approaching the individual. That's why I started off by saying I think what we've got to do is learn about how we are influenced by the broader structure of social relations we're part of. And of course the current concern with knife crime is rather similar. I haven't heard inequality mentioned once. But there are 60 or more papers on inequality and violence. The first came out in the 1970s. So it's very well established. I don't know why they don't want to think about, whether they don't want to think or can't get to grips with structural determinants, but that's, and maybe the teaching of people like yourselves will mean that in a, I don't know, 10 years' time, you'll have people in positions where they do think more naturally about those kinds of causal processes. But I think we need to put the fear of God up them as well.
Sorry, take the guy with the shirt first and then you. Is that okay? Yeah?
I'm not surprised at all at that response from politicians, because they're not rational and evidence-based, they're ideological-based, and I would venture to suggest that perhaps there's a correlation between more unequal societies and more sort of punitive and pathologizing ideologies and narratives of surplus populations and all this sort of stuff. I think Brazil and the USA, for instance, there might be a correlation there, but it's not evidence-based.
Not evidently.
It's not. These people aren't evidence-based. They're ideologically based.
Yes.
There's a correlation between the type of society and the type of dominant ideology.
Yeah. Yes, and when you see the sort of slanging matches that have been in Commons recently, and our local MP was talking about Corbyn as a Marxist or something, and it just shows how little they know about Marxism.
My memory is very near, but I think it was Denmark that recently had they were running a pilot around universal income.
Sorry, I'm not hearing.
So recently, I think it was Denmark ended the pilot around universal income.
Oh yes.
And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or reflections around that, because what I'd read about it was that it hadn't increased employment necessarily, but it had increased levels of happiness.
Yeah, I think, and what people were afraid of was, of course, it would lead to a decline in employment. People would feel they didn't have to work, and I think it was shown not to do that. There have been a number of trials of things like universal basic income, negative income tax and stuff, reviewed by Rutger Bregman, I think he's called, from the Netherlands, and quite a nice summary, and it looks as if nearly all of them have been pretty positive. Kate, my partner and co-author, is hoping to do a trial of universal basic income. She is part of a big study, a cohort study called Born in Bradford, following up kids born in a few years in Bradford. But I think why it's really important is that, you know, if the economists are right that artificial intelligence, automation is going to create, well, if it's right to think that it's a threat to, I don't know, a third or half of all our jobs, then it's really important that that isn't a disaster by throwing so many people out of work and making the people who own the machinery super rich. You know, we need to redistribute income and work. And in a way, it's the biggest choice in front of us, whether automation is an absolute curse for our society or whether it's the greatest blessing because we've really, you know, liberated a large proportion of the population from, you know, all this business of not having time with your kids and friends and family and so on.
We've got time for one more quick question. Somebody want to say something exciting and pertinent? Or even something mundane?
Can I just say, it seems to me that it's quite straightforward why we have politicians who don't necessarily want to do anything about inequality. We talk about the state as a sort of disembodied, well, its own entity, but it's really a mass of individuals. And those individuals would be acting against their own self-interest if they allowed social mobility, for instance. To allow social mobility, you've got to have somebody move out of the way to get somebody into that position.
Yeah.
And the people that are in those positions and their families
Yes.
won't actually move out of that way.
Yeah, I do think it's about power, and so in terms of solutions, let me just show you that's what's happened to inequality. You get the huge rise in inequality under Thatcher in the 1980s, and then some little ups and downs. But the long-term changes in inequality, the whole of the 20th century looked sort of U-shaped, with inequality bottoming out in the late 70s, and then the modern rise in inequality across all the different countries. But you can see that decline in inequality and then the modern rise of inequality are basically the rise and fall of the labour movement. The top line there is inequality in the United States. You see it's a different measure, so it's slightly different shape, U-shaped distribution. But the bottom line is the proportion of the labour force in trade unions. It's not that trade unions suddenly give you 10 times as much money. It's that trade unions are a marker of the strength of the whole labour movement, the fear of communism, the, if you like, the strength of the countervailing voice in society. How often you feel, you hear on Question Time or read newspaper articles, people putting forward a very different opinion. And of course, trade union leaders can do that with the benefit of their research departments behind them. So I think actually we need to go down the road towards economic democracy. I don't think we can get trade unions back to their former strength now the heavy industries have gone, but I do think we should move towards democratizing the workplace, extending democracy into the workplace. It reduces the income differences within workplaces, it improves productivity, and it looks as if those companies are nicer places to work. So that's where I would like to go as a long-term objective. And I think that actually there are some of the people around the centre of politics, as well as on the left, who favour that too, an occasional conservative even.
Okay, I'm just mindful of getting you back to the train station. Can we just finish off by thanking Richard again for a really, really interesting and inspiring